welcome to Scholars in a Bar. Our guest today is Owen Flanagan. Owen is the James B. Duke Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Neurobiology at Duke University. And Owen has a new book, and it's called How to Do Emotions: The Morality of Anger and Shame Across Cultures. And I think this is a very interesting topic, particularly now, because you could hardly turn on the news these days and not see anger, lots of anger, different groups. And so maybe we can figure out why this is happening and what we should do about it in this talk. So Owen, welcome and thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Al, for having me both. This is fun.
Okay, Al, why don't you start us off?
Okay, yes. Yes, as you said, Mike, when you turn on the news nowadays, you see a lot of anger. And you also see a tremendous, in many instances, lack of shame. And that is an interesting phenomenon in our society today. And I think that Owen has a lot to teach us relative to this. And so I'm very, very pleased to be able to ask Owen this first question. Based on the thesis of your book, Owen, many people, I think, would say, you know, shame is not something, emotions aren't something you do. Emotions are something that you have. And so I'm going to ask you, are emotions something you have? Are they something you do? Or are they both something you have and do?
Thanks, Al, for starting us off that way. So there are lots of different views about the emotions. And one very traditional view is that emotions are things, as it were, that just sort of arise in us. They're external causes. And if the right external causes exist, then the emotion will arise in us. Maybe we'll come back to this and talk about some of the different theories of emotions. So there is very much a view in that vicinity that emotions are almost like reflexes. If the doctor taps you on the knee, well, the knee will jerk if he hits you in the right spot. If you hit your funny bone, it'll feel like a funny bone was hit. You can't will it away. It just happens to you. And there have been many views about the emotions that emphasize that side. So the first thing I'll give away is that, of course, you're right, that there's some parts of emotions which just happen to us, as it were. Just like there's some parts of perception that just happens to us. We see the apple tree and it's in our field of vision and it comes into us. But what I'm trying to do in the book is sort of, and it's why emotions are things we do is more of a motto than a strict thesis that I'll defend and die in the last ditch for. The emphasis I want to put on things is that if you look across cultures for anything that we call basic emotions, you'll find that the kinds of things that people, to stick with anger, get angry about vary hugely across cultures. So for example, there's lots of road rage in America. There is not road rage in identical traffic in Japan. That's interesting. That clearly shows that the mechanisms of even getting angry don't just happen with things like having a traffic jam in front of you. You have to be enculturated into a culture that sends messages that it's normal and appropriate to get into road rage. The other thing about it is that there are a lot of different things you can do once you get angry about something, right? And there are different degrees that we talk about. You know, we often say to each other, whoa, 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 to loved ones even, you're way too angry. I didn't do anything to cause you to be that angry. So there we're trying to impose a kind of norms on the degree to which someone gets angry about this, that, and the other thing. And the third thing is how we express anger. So a lot of the studies that I've been looking at, anthropology and cultural psychology, show, for example, that among German and American mothers, when they get angry at their children, the child and the mothers engage and escalate anger. In many other cultures, especially East Asia, mothers and children separate themselves when they get angry and de-escalate anger. So those are the kind of things I'm trying to emphasize with my motto, emotions are things we do, partly because if you think about emotions as things that just happen to you or that you're passive with respect to, you won't think about ways to change them when you're in trouble. And for reasons that both you and Mike said at the very beginning, I've been thinking for a long time that our culture is in trouble in terms of the degree of anger, the rapidity with which we get angry and pissed off, the ways in which we interact with each other, because anger is an emotion that doesn't listen. And one of our biggest problems now is people don't listen to each other. They stomp their feet and assert and yell. We see this in the political sphere. We also see it in social media, which I think, for all the good the internet has done us, it gives permission to people to say outrageous things to each other that they would never say face to face. They would never say face to face. So that's the general idea. As I said, I wouldn't die in the last ditch for the idea that emotions are a thing. Every aspect of an emotion is something that we have control over. But I think we have a lot more control, not as individuals always, but in terms of social practices and having people role model different ways of doing the emotions. There's even an article I just saw in the Washington Post. The headline said, Biden is already doing something for the atmospherics of anger. And I think that's a fair thing to say. He's modeling a different sort of behavior.
Well, why do people get angry? And I'm kind of taking this back maybe to an evolutionary point of view. Is there some reason that we as Homo sapiens have emotions as part of our structure?
Yeah, really good question. So, Mike, thank you for that. The usual view is something like this, that there are what are called basic emotions. One pretty highly thought of view about basic emotions is that Darwin in the 1870s, in a book called The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, he suggested that there were certain faces that humans make characteristically for different basic emotions. The current list of the basic emotions are surprise, happy, sad, scared, contempt, disgust, sadness. And the thought is that those are conveyed facially and that they have an evolutionary function. Probably part of the evolutionary function is social. So if you see me, if we're hiking together again and I show a scared face and you happen to see me showing the scared face, then you have a readout that we're in a dangerous situation possibly. Anger looks, if we look at infants, when people first start to say infants show anger, we all have, do you have children, Mike, Al?
Just cats. We have our cats are our kids.
Well, Darwin doesn't say anything about cats, but he thinks that that dogs were domesticated and have very similar facial expressions to us. But other animals show frustration and anger at especially threats. And so infants will show it when they get frustrated. Of course, animals like dogs and probably cats. I don't know much about cats.
If I pay too much attention to one cat as opposed to the other cat, you can see a facial expression of displeasure on the cat who's not getting the attention.
Exactly. And and what the people who study these emotions have found is that we're very sensitive to these movements of the facial musculature. For example, literally, disgust and contempt. So disgust is more like if you, instead of your whiskey or whatever we're drinking now, our cocktails, we were to take a sip of sour milk, we would show a disgust face. A disgust face is very close to a contempt face, where contempt is for another. I feel contemptuous towards another human being. That face is just like the disgust face, except it involves muscles that curl one side of the mouth. So these faces are highly recognizable across culture. So one thought is, sure, all these emotions have adaptive value. Back in the day, if you come after my mate or my food, I'm going to get angry and I might well come after you. If I come after you and I'm bigger and stronger than you, you might have a scared face. And this would probably be highly adaptive to have these emotions. Yeah. Now, of course, the way we had them when the ice melted at the end of the Pleistocene and the way we have them now, that's part of the point. They're very socially constructed and developed in modern worlds.
Well, is anger related always or never or what? But it seems to me that anger is often linked to disappointment.
Yes,
It's disappointment that triggers anger more than anything else.
I think that's fair. Good. That's good. Yeah. And so then we might ask the question, what kinds of things, I said frustration, but I think that's fair to say disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's right. And so the question would be, suppose it is a perfectly reasonable emotion to have when, for example, you're disappointed because someone let you down. I think that's fair, okay, to be disappointed and express anger to someone who lets you down. And that enables you to have a conversation with them and for them possibly to notice something that they hadn't been paying enough attention to and so on. So it can open up a conversation. I think the ways we're having anger now is that people are, you might say, way too thin-skinned about, able to get angry about everything.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also so tribally attached in certain ways. And here I'm talking more about the political sphere, I think, than other spheres. But people feel maybe more permission than they should to feel disappointed. I mean, the example I always give, this is a silly example, and I might have given it the last time we talked, but I watched I was at a place, it was at a college a couple of years ago, and they have a Starbucks on the campus, actually Wake Forest University. And it was a long line, and I got my espresso and I sat down, and there were some people behind me. And I heard this girl get up to the counter, but right before she got to the counter, someone in front of her did something like this. They said, "I'll have 2 triple macchiatos with coconut shavings and this, that, and the other thing, and I'm gonna pay you by check." And this girl goes to her friends. "You wouldn't believe what happened to me. That's so-and-so in front of me. She kind of did this and she did that." And her friends say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, you poor thing, da, da, da." And I thought to myself, this is a kind of weird idea that we have, that the world or the cosmos is supposed to cooperate or has its attention on coffee lines for us, and that we're not to be inconvenienced by the world, and that your friends are supposed to console you. I mean, it isn't like they lost a loved one, but it's that, so the degrees to which we feel permission to be disappointed, I think is a sign that our ego is a little bit too ready to have, we want what we want, and we want it fast. And I think that is a tendency. Some of the research shows that the number one thing that Americans get angry about is wasting my time.
Mm-hmm.
Often people say, when they question people with open-ended interviews, they'll say, "Wasting my fucking time." That's important, actually, because it's the sense of angry possession. This thing is mine, and no one else should mess with it. And sure, sometimes it happens that people really are inconsiderate about our time. But, I don't know, if you go to coffee shops, you have to wait in line sometimes.
Well, I think in American, because the way we've shaped our culture, wasting my time means 2 things. It means wasting my life,
Yep.
because we have this concept that my life consists of nothing but time. And the other, it means wasting my money, because time is money in America. Okay. So you've got 2 culturally shaped things there that I think kind of into our response. Would you agree with that?
I totally agree with that. I think, and that's exactly the way I like to look at these things. In other words, when I say things like, that we could change the way we do anger and shame and even other emotions, my idea is this is not like a self-help or a therapeutic thing. It's calling upon us to sort of think about all the different messages that we give each other and how we've constructed our political economy and our social life that engender things like Mike was saying, too much impatience or feeling like the world is interfering or obstructing your life. And as you said, the message that time is money and our time consciousness in America is very different from, again, many other cultures. So
well, I'm thinking of the Buddhist, and if I were a Buddhist monk and people were to say, you're wasting my time in that fashion, I'd probably say, you need to get over yourself.
Yes, that's right. Well, and what's nice about that, exactly what you said, Al, there are these different traditions. I always think, I think this comes from the Stoics, but Stoics were in the West the first philosophers. Cicero was a Stoic, about 100. Well, the Stoics were around for a long time, but the Stoics worried about being emotionally overwrought in a host of ways. And anger was their primary example. And interestingly enough, like the Stoic Seneca has a wonderful essay called On Anger. And he says things, now this is interesting because if you think about the Stoics, what are they famous for? They're famous for their armies. And what the Stoics thought is that good soldiers don't get angry. Angry soldiers rape and pillage. Stoic soldiers just win battles when necessary. And so the idea was that anger is a dangerous emotion. And so the Stoics had phrases like that you could recite when you're in the traffic or in the coffee shop. And it's very Buddhist, although it's Stoic. Be indifferent to indifferent things. And that's why the Stoics used to say, oh, we should study astronomy because astronomy makes you realize that you're not the most important thing in the world and that God or the universe is not focused on making everything convenient for you.
You get the same message in the Bhagavad Gita in many respects, because in the Gita, there's this idea that the warrior, Arjuna, is being counseled that, you're not going against your kinfolk because you're angry with them, but because the universe demands it. You're doing it for other reasons.
Right.
And it's the reason that you're doing for it that this is important.
Right.
And you really get that in the Gita. I mean, very much so. So I'm thinking of all of these other cross-cultural parallels as you're talking about this, and it's like, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I even think of C.S. Lewis writing about this during World War II, and he's talking about how you go into battle not hating your enemy. You go out of a sense of duty for the greater cause, but not with, and that which raises, of course, another interesting issue, and that is, can we train troops to be successful without hate in their heart? Do we have to demonize the enemy in order to win the battle? And I don't know if have you done much research in that?
I've only done a little bit, and I was there's some good work actually by a philosopher at Georgetown named Nancy Sherman. She's written a book, among other books, Stoic Warriors. She actually was very interesting. Nancy was called from Georgetown to be the first professor of ethics at the Naval Academy after the tailhook scandal. Remember that? The tailhook was, I forget, bawdy fraternity-like behavior on major ships, something like that. You might remember the details better. But the Navy thought they had a problem. And Nancy Sherman is a good philosopher and ethicist, and she has written some about this. So, and she asks exactly your question about and we do know that usually a lot of American soldiers, high-level generals and colonels and things, do sometimes read Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and basically these Stoic texts. I think, by the way, one of the things the Stoics say, and as you've been saying, as soon as you start to think about this, it sort of becomes obvious, I think, that one can emphasize what I'm trying to emphasize, which is that if you're getting into trouble with something you're doing, anything personally or as a culture, it sometimes can be a good idea to look to other sources. And what's lucky about the modern world is we live in these multicultural worlds where we know about all these different traditions. And people often do things differently than we do. And so sometimes you can go to a text like you say, what wisdom is there in the Bhagavad Gita, or what in the New Testament or the Old Testament or Confucius? And that's sort of one of my things that I think is a way I like to introduce students nowadays to philosophy, is say, remind them there are other ways of being a human being in your vicinity. Sometimes, you get on the subway in New York and you look around and you think, God, there's all these people in these funny outfits. I don't know, maybe that's a Buddhist one, maybe that's a Muslim one. I don't know, is it Sunni or Shia? Is it Theravada Buddhist, or is it this? What about that guy, the Orthodox Jewish guy? There's Mike from Louisiana, etc. And, many of those people embody different ways of doing things that we can learn from sometimes. That's sort of the idea.
Yeah, well, I think my own personal opinion that in an age of pluralism, religious pluralism, we have a great advantage that we previously did not have. And simply rigorously holding on to our own religious tradition without garnering the wisdom that is in other religious traditions is foolhardy. And I'm reminded of Houston Smith's way of talking about multiple religious traditions as being the wisdom traditions. And that it's great to have one inform the other. I think that's so true.
Yeah, that's right.
We haven't talked anything about shame. And I'm really interested in shame because, one of the dictums in our culture that I see is don't be ashamed, And we were talking about us all being children of the 60s, that I remember Woodstock. I remember Woodstock very well. And I remember people running around naked through the farmland there in upstate New York, admonishing whether do not be ashamed of your body. And I remember the old phrase, let it all hang out. And I remember the Esalen Institute, the sensitivity movement, in which you were told to give free expression of your emotions and of your bodily movements. I'm sure you remember it well, Owen, in the same way that I do. And what kind of legacy has that left us? And is that a good legacy or a bad legacy? I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, I do think about those times. Let me just say, maybe I can move into it this way. Mike, you must have just been a little bit younger than us, right? During the late 60s?
Yeah, he's only a kid. He's about 5 years younger than us.
Yeah, he's a baby. Well, one of the things I say in this new book, which you guys have taken a look at, is that, one nice thing about living for a long time, and since Al and I are the same age, is that you do get perspective and you do watch how quickly things change and how much they stay the same sometimes too. But I do say in the book that this is the second greatest cultural turmoil that I've ever lived in my life. And it's almost exactly 50 years apart. So yeah, as Al says, there's 1967 was the summer of love and hate Ashbury. And it was also the summer of 157 race riots throughout the United States, everywhere from Watts to Newark, New Jersey, but 157 of them. Now those are
Detroit was pretty nasty.
Yeah, and of course, so the summer of love and hate Ashbury, which Joan Didion wrote about in Crouching Towards Bethlehem, The Center's Not Holding, from Yeats's poem. That was a very peculiar time, right, of the missing children. And of course, the next year was Woodstock. So there was this one sort of cultural movement happening among semi-liberated, in some weird way, white kids, right? Because that's all that was in the hate, and that's all that was in Woodstock. And then there's the Black culture, and of course, here we have Haight Ashbury in San Francisco, and then right across the bay, we have the Black Panthers are going to come along, out of in Oakland. So, it was a very peculiar time. I mean, what I do say, I think there was so much morally serious that was going on during those times, it seemed to me, because we were so concerned about civil rights. White kids were, as well as black kids. But there was the war in Vietnam problem, this war that was a serious problem. And then there was this kind of frivolousness about hippiedom and, not things I necessarily disapprove of. I mean, having fun and, taking recreational drugs. It didn't seem like the worst thing that ever happened in the world, but it also lacked to a certain extent a kind of a seriousness that I associated it with the other movements of that time. But you're right about it, that was a time in which there was discourse about, people started living together as opposed to getting married, for example. That was something that was in the previous generation, I think, very, people just didn't think about that as an option for the most part. So did that cause, or is that a causal element in what I see as the current lack of shame or the shamelessness in contemporary culture? The answer is maybe, but I'm not very good at drawing sort of causal threads, because you're right to point out that was a point in time in which, at least about certain things about which people, as you remember, would say the adults were way too uptight about.
Oh yeah, I remember uptight.
We had to be less uptight about. And it seems to me that some of those things that the adults were uptight about are in fact things that it was good that we became less uptight about. My current big concern about shamelessness, and I don't want to say I saw it coming, as one friend of mine said to me recently, he said, what's going on right now is really good for your book, Owen, but shit for the country. And he was referring to the shamelessness about speaking falsely. That's what really worries me, the impunity about being truthful, the lack, and that to me is our biggest crisis right now in the country. We have 50 million people, according to the statistics, who voted for Trump, who believe the big lie about the election. Now, if that's remotely true, then there's just a very serious problem that we had leaders who didn't mind telling us false things. And that's something I think good people ought to be ashamed about. I'm not sure what to be done about that, but I think shame is the right emotion to feel.
Do people, though, honestly believe these things always? It seems to me that for both liberals and Democrats, there are creeds that people have to say. And if you're conservative, or particularly on the Trump side, the election was stolen. If you're liberal, healthcare is a right and we need universal healthcare. And even if you think, hey, that might not always economically be the best thing, you're going to say it because it's part of the creed that you say to belong to the group. And I'm wondering, are we being driven by creeds that are on us? Sort of the dogma of being a conservative or a liberal. Or
that may well be. That may well be. Some of the research I've looked at, this is from other fields, philosophers don't do this kind of empirical work, but a lot of people are suggesting that they're seeing, social scientists, is first there's a tribal affiliation and then you look at the evidence. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you were just getting at. I think it's clear that being liberal or conservative, say in America, does come with certain values which are taken for granted in the creed. It does seem to me to be different. If I scratch a liberal, I know that they'll believe in universal health care. And if I scratch a conservative, they might not, we'll say. Okay, I get that. That's a difference in values, and we can talk about those. I think what becomes most worrisome is when there become disagreements about facts and evidence and what counts. And sure, that's why I'm more worried about this one than I am about most things in my life, because I think this is clearly, what in philosophy we call an epistemological crisis. It's a crisis about authority and and what counts as evidence and what counts as logic?
I think you're 110% correct on that, Owen. It's one thing to say we have a disagreement. We see the facts and we understand them, and then we have a disagreement relative to a policy, its alternatives to address the facts. But to deny the facts, that's dangerous.
Right.
That puts you in a very untenable situation once that happens.
Right.
And how we overcome this at this point, I'm not completely sure, but we really need to find a way to overcome this disparity.
Do you guys think it has to do with one hypothesis, but we philosophers can generate hypotheses in our armchairs, so they're not very well tested. But one thing I wondered about, because we all were there at the beginning when the internet first came out, and I remember at the time, people, at least in university life, we would say things like, well, there's a lot of crap out there, but gradually over time, it'll be like selection, natural selection work to improve us. There'll be informational selection, and the knowledge will sort of come out, and that will be wonderful for science. And some people say Wikipedia is a success story in that way, that because of the way Wikipedia works, it's fairly reliable when experts check it. But there's something about the social media part of it that allows every single person's opinion and spinning of tails to count equally. I think that is part of the problem here. At least that's one of my suspicions.
I have to tell you something relative that is humorous and not humorous. It's humorous and it's very sad. My wife came home from doing a gig. She serves wine at various locations because she's a wine master. And so she actually presents wines. And this guy came up to her and he wasn't wearing a mask. So she called him on not wearing a mask. He said, well, those things don't help you any. And she said, oh. And he said, yeah, here, I'll show you. Here is a study from Johns Hopkins University. Not Johns Hopkins, but John Hopkins, which led us to the conclusion this guy was getting a study from some guy by the name of John Hopkins.
Right.
And it's like, that's what's out there.
Yeah.
And it's like, instead of evolving, it's like devolving, for crying out. And that's one of the things I'm aware of in terms of evolution of anything. Well, you can evolve, you can also devolve.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. No, so this is a disturbing one. But as far as the idea of shame goes, I think that what I did start to notice is just the amount. There's a tendency to think about the emotion of shame as something not Western. People will often say, okay, there are shame cultures and there are guilt cultures. And shame cultures, people will say, those are ones, like, example you'll often hear of, which is not a bad example, is you might remember a few years ago, there was a bunch of Korean school children who went on a ferry trip, like a school trip out of Seoul down somewhere, short of 1 day. But they had overloaded the ferry and it sank. And some number of adorable, innocent children were drowned in this. And within a week or so, that the principal of the school, I think, maybe the mayor of the town, the head of the company, they had all hung themselves. And this is very peculiar to us, of course, but and I'm not encouraging that sort of thing, but sometimes the thought is, oh, this is a very primitive kind of hara-kiri, group solidarity, totalitarian almost against. But I think the good use of thinking about an emotion like shame would be that it's a social emotion. It just says, in order to work together in a community, there are certain things which we're going to be accountable for in the eyes of each other. Certain things we will do and not do. And they might include things like, you can count on me if you elect me to be, the town manager or representative or the president, to tell you the truth. And that's a condition of, kind of a basic condition of social life. Now, whether or not you should feel guilty for not telling me the truth and you're going to burn in hell for all eternity or whatever in the eyes of God, I'm not that interested in that. But it just seems that the necessary conditions of social life involve things like truth-telling, honesty, doing what you said, etc. And that's where I think it would be useful. One reason goes back to something Al said. In religion, in America now, there are too many religions. There's no one religion that's going to that you're going to be sort of answerable in the eyes of God, because there's too many gods. Okay, it's not a polytheistic situation. It's just that there are many different religious traditions. They all have somewhat different things to say about, moral obligations and moral duties and political duties. And then, of course, there are all the secular and non-religious types. So I think we're back to having to figure out ways, despite not having common religions, not having a common even secular religion, to figure out ways to do social life and agree.
Well, one of the things that I'm aware of as an individual who studies a lot of comparative religion, and one of the courses I teach is on comparative religious ethics, is that when it comes to ethical norms, it is surprising how most religions are relatively close.
Yep.
The principle of reciprocity is stated in just about all major religious traditions. But in fact, I can't think of one where it's not.
I agree.
The idea of the elevation of truth is something that is stated in all religions. I can't think of anywhere it is not. Human beneficence is something that is stated in all religions, and I can't think of anywhere that it is not. In some religions, they even go beyond human beneficence, and they're concerned about plant and animal beneficence, not just human beneficence, but beneficence of anything that's sentient in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, that's right.
And all those things are common to the major religious traditions of the world. Where they tend to differ is on cosmologically and ontologically, but not so much when it comes to basic ethics. There might be some differences occasionally here and there that are culturally conditioned, cultural norms that are different.
I agree.
In Confucianism,
what you see,
loyalty is held above individual rights. But
I see the same
for the most part.
I see the same thing you do. There's lots of agreement. There's lots of agreements about virtues. They might have a little different priority, like you said. In Confucianism, filial loyalty to the family will be a higher value than universal rights. You get that. Buddhism doesn't have much to say about justice because they emphasize compassion so much.
Exactly.
But all these variations, there's almost never a virtue in one tradition, which is a vice in another. Rarely. I'm starting to think that one thing that used to be a vice across most traditions has become a virtue in America, and it's been redescribed. What I'm thinking about here is the deadly sin of avarice. And I think if you have avaricious, insatiable appetites, then back to Mike's point about the causes of anger, guaranteed, you'll always have reason to be angry because there's never enough. And
I can't think of a single religious tradition, be it East or West, where avarice is lifted up as a virtue, but it is in terms of American culture.
You're the first person besides me who I've ever heard say that, but I don't think I've ever said it before in public until now. But yeah, I think it's redescribed in lots of ways as, in a language, I don't know, Mike, I don't know if they did this when you were at Harvard Business School, but, there's a language of, genius, entrepreneurship, innovation, and there's a celebration then of, many of these people end up being wonderful philanthropists, but for every philanthropist on my side of the political fence, there's a philanthropist on the other side who's also a fat cat. And so that's the fact that there are 2,200, I think, billionaires in the world right now, a few trillionaires in the world right now, So,
well, you could say that Mother Teresa, in her own way, was an innovative entrepreneurial genius.
Sure.
But it wasn't based on avarice.
Yeah, probably any religious leader who got some fans, namely all the ones we know about, was good at the game. By the way, did you read? This is a side point, but did either of you ever read a book by Colin Toybin? He's an Irish writer, called "The Testament of Mary."
No.
Meryl Streep did a one-woman show on Broadway of it. It's an interesting story. It's you know how there are all the other gospels besides Matthew,
Yeah.
Luke, and John, they find. So this one is a story of Mary, and the opening scene is when whoever the two contemporaneous gospel writers show up to see Mary after Jesus is crucified, and they ask her, "So tell us what happened at that wedding feast." And she says, "Yeah, they ran out of booze and there was a beer run." What about the dead guy? Oh, he was very sick, but he didn't die. But then she talks about her son, and she said he was peculiar, but he was like all young men trying to make it in Jerusalem as a public speaker. And I thought about, I was saying to my students one time, I said, what's the most important thing for a professional quarterback in football besides, all the athletic gifts? A good voice. A voice that projects and carries is really, really important. And she says that's the main thing that Jesus had, and he was good at anyway, it's just back to this idea that these people, religious leaders are entrepreneurs, but sometimes for good.
So, Owen, do we have too little shame, not enough shame these days, or have we lost the foundation on what shame should be based? Because I can see people, when you've talked about how the areas have changed, and one of the things that I can see is we've left the old system where we can put the scarlet letter on people or put people in stocks to shame them, because today, with the internet and the ability to find common groups, even though everybody you live around may find your behavior shameful, you can find communities now that accept what you do and don't find it that way.
Yeah.
This is a very, very good point. Yeah, this is one thing I read about. I mean, you just made me think of something. That one of the things about certain kinds of paranoid people apparently are able to find communities of other paranoid people very easily now, which doesn't help them work through their paranoia or take their meds. They just find, oh yeah, there are 2,000 other Americans who think the same crazy things I do. So yes, there are communities that will affirm us. So that's part of the problem, I think, that anybody, no matter what their values are, can be affirmed in these ways. It's a good question you ask about, though, what do we need? I guess, maybe the hint, I'll use what Al said earlier about that there is surprising commonality that you might be able to get across most people's form of life, whether they come from Confucian or Orthodox Jewish or Catholic or you name it, village atheist or pagan. You will find a lot of agreement about a proper, the best values. And then maybe what we would need to do is start to feel comfortable not letting people feel like they could just settle on any values they want, let it all hang out. But there just are certain things that are necessary for common life, that we be able to trust each other, that we all learn maybe in starting in elementary school, what we philosophers call logic and epistemology, just what are the rules of evidence? I mean, that's one thing that's maybe very worried right now is that, if it's the case, because you questioned this, Michael, that it might be something different, and I agree with that. But if it is the case that people actually do believe things that are patently false, large, numbers of people, then and most of these people have education of a certain sort, then they've gone through school without learning basic principles of statistics, probability theory, basic logic, and so on. That should be of great concern to us as.
Absolutely. I have thought for years that we make a major mistake in American high schools in teaching calculus.
Yeah.
Not that calculus is bad.
Right.
And there is certainly, depending on your profession, a subset of people that will need it.
Right.
but
That's
we
right.
don't teach statistics.
Yeah.
Everybody needs statistics.
Totally.
Everybody needs to understand, did this happen because it was a miracle or just because it was highly improbable and I should have expected it?
Totally. I totally agree with you. And that would help us if people knew statistics and probability right now, because then you would be able at least to say, if people were listening, things like that everybody who's looked at this, election officials, et cetera, they could tell you the probabilities and statistics. I agree with that. Actually, years ago, I remember reading, I always wondered this. I loved mathematics through linear algebra in college after calculus. But someone said to me, do you know why we learn trigonometry in 11th grade? I said, I don't really know that. Why? And they said, it was because at the beginning of high schools, it used to be earlier in high school, it's that at the turn of the 19th century, 1900, 1 in 10 Americans went to high school and 1 in 10 of those finished high school. So only 1 in 100. But many people who went to high school were going to high school for westward expansion and were trying to be surveyors. And if you think about it, oh, that's why trig is there. And of course, it is good for engineering to learn trig and then calculus. But you're absolutely right. For most people, it might be much better to learn certain kind of reasoning and evidence skills. So something's wrong in that department. Yeah.
So how do we deal with the problem of anger in the United States today? Do you have any things that you've thought of that could put us on a better path?
Well, I think that there might be different things that have to happen in different ways. So let me tell you one that I'd be interested in your response to, because it's a book about Louisiana that came out before 2016 by Arlie Hochschild called Strangers. I think it's called Strangers in Their Own Land. And so she was interested in looking at what she already detected, and she's a Berkeley sociologist. And this was, I read everything I could on the Tea Party a long time ago. I started to think about this a long time ago because I saw anger. And by the way, I see as much anger on the political left as on the political right. Because I would say to my friends, who happen to be mostly progressive or liberal, about this anger problem, and they would, say, oh yes, those terrible people on the other side. But no, it's both sides. But what Hochschild did was, I think she had a very interesting, and it might be very local diagnosis. She said that when she went into post-Katrina areas of Louisiana, among the kind of people who were especially angry, she found, and prone to be on the Tea Party side, she would hear the same story again and again. There'd be, there's a white shrimp boat owner like me, we'll say. I lost my boat in Katrina. I'm waiting for the money. My wife and I, nice Christian wife, because we came up at the time that you're supposed to be heterosexual and we have a nice family. Meanwhile, my son is addicted to opiates over here. I had hoped he'd take over the business, but I haven't gotten the money to pay me back for the shrimp boat that I lost anyway. And whenever I look into the news, I just find out that Washington is concerned with Mexican immigrants who I hear are taking jobs, but I haven't met one of them yet, and gay people they're all concerned about their rights. And I was told that that's not a right way to live. And so she had this constant theme that there was at least the message that these people were receiving, mostly not too well-off white folk, was that other people were always jumping the line. And it was a violation of a kind of a way America is supposed to work, that we stand in line. I thought that was a very, very powerful book. And I think what that shows is that there's a lot of things that opens up. Among them are governments giving attention to people who are really bad off due to circumstances beyond their control. And then it leads to less frustration. And if you're less frustrated, you're less angry. So that's just one. You might have a lot of local, these might be things that have to be done at the political level locally, for example. As far as the more global level, I just think role models play a really important part here. And I think it's only right, it's only recent, right, when during the election, when people started to say things like, well, we're going to have someone who's going to lower the temperature. I think you need that. Kids really need that too. If they learned how to fight by what they see on the evening news or by the nasty things that people say to each other, that's terrible for us, terrible for the future. So a lot of it is role modeling. A lot of it is, teaching people how to be good listeners. And, but I think an awful lot of it has to do with role models. I do think they're crucially important.